up until this point, I mean, we've talked a lot about dieting and weight loss and some of the problems there, and there's always more to dig into there, and we'll definitely continue to. But with especially with the season now, with the holidays coming up, we've got Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and New Year's resolutions, and so dieting and weight loss is always a pretty huge topic on people's minds, especially when they're around family, also, but also when they're around a lot of food. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in kind of digging into some of the perspectives there as far as why we might want to try to avoid some of the dieting mindset and how to work through that and how to get through these next few months kind of comfortably without falling into some of the dieting mindset. And really, I mean, a huge part of this is creating a lifestyle that is really based in the long term as opposed to the short term. So much of the dieting side is based on short term results, quick fixes, losing 10 pounds in a week or 15 pounds in a month or whatever it is, at the expense of our health. And really, in any sort of, if you want to call it a diet, but in any sort of way of eating and way of living, these sorts of things shouldn't really be, being around a lot of food and a lot of food that you like to eat or that tastes really good shouldn't be a problem. It should be a good thing if at all, or if anything. And same thing with spending that time with family too. And a lot of times this becomes really stressful, especially when it comes to people who are concerned about gaining weight or wanting to lose weight. So just to start, I mean, just to kind of reiterate some of these things that we've discussed before, really the fundamental idea that all of these diets are coming from is this idea that our bodies are fighting against us and that they want us to be, in this case, overweight or unhealthy. And so because of that, we have to always be fighting against our own body's signals. And in this case, we're talking more specifically about hunger and cravings. And so if we're hungry for whatever food is available, or we're craving it, or we're really enjoying it, or we want to eat a lot of food, that becomes a problem because, we're being told that we don't want to listen to that. And if we do, we'll end up being, we'll end up overweight and unhealthy. And that's really not at all the case. But when you're looking at it from this perspective, the only solution to these scenarios, when you're stuck at the at the table with all this food in front of you, the only solution is just restraint and using willpower to restrict and to prevent yourself from eating too much. I'll have just a small serving of this, just a little taste or whatever it is, so that you don't overeat. And both of us have, as we've talked about, both of us have experienced that for huge parts of our lives in various ways. And sometimes it might have been, just restricting carbs. Other times it's restricting other groups of foods, but also as far as just restricting food overall and not allowing ourselves to eat as much as as much as our bodies needed, as much as our bodies were telling us that they needed. And so many people live that way in a really extreme way for much of their lives, often, their entire lives. And that's one of the most tragic things about this, is that so many people, especially, it's especially the case for women when they're really, really young and, really starting this kind of diet cycle from, like extremely young ages, sometimes before the age of 10. And then that sort of stuff becomes so ingrained and really drives their perspective and relationship with food for the rest of their lives. And obviously men are experiencing that stuff as well. So,
I mean, I think there's, I think there's an importance in some restriction, but I don't think it's in quantity as much as it is in what specific foods are being eaten. I think that's probably the most important area. So, and I think that that's where a lot of the misguided dieting stuff comes from, is this model of you need this model behind the idea of energy, calories in, calories out, where a lot of people think that if they eat a little bit on the holidays of everything and they keep all their portions small and then they exercise extremely hard later on, they've like somehow balanced the scales of the food gods, where you're not going to gain any weight or anything like that. And just the entire paradigm, I don't think makes much sense, especially if it's viewed in that lens. I mean, you can make the calories in, calories out idea can make sense, but there's a lot of modifiers that go into understanding that and nuances beyond the fact of I ate X number of calories today and then I ran for X amount of time on a treadmill and it told me that I burned that many calories, so therefore I'm fine. I don't think that makes any sense, and I think that the idea of needing to diet or dieting in general is extremely misguided. And I think it doesn't work because the idea behind a diet or dieting or the implied aspect of it is that it's for a short period of time for a specific result. And I don't think
Mhm.
that that makes any sense. And that's not really how the body really works. I think people need to address things from a lifestyle point of view. And it's not, and so the idea is to have the correct paradigm underpinning what lifestyle point of view, particularly related to food, are you going to hold? And I don't think the calories in, calories out model through which it's current, like the context and the way it's currently viewed is helpful, especially for weight loss. And I mean, we've had X number of years of people yo-yo dieting and dieting. It's not even it's even it's redundant to say yo-yo dieting. The idea of dieting implies periods of famine and then periods of feast going alternating with each other. So like to say yo-yo dieting doesn't make any sense. There's no, the idea of dieting needs to go, and the idea of adjusting lifestyle needs to take center precedence. And then this idea of calories in, calories out, where you can weigh the scales with exercise for eating, not so great foods, that doesn't make any sense either. If anything, it makes it worse. If you're going to put a demand on your body with exercise, then you're going to need to fuel your body properly, not only with adequate fuel sources, but adequate cofactors to allow those fuel sources to function. So going out and slamming 32 ounces of a I don't know whatever, like an icy or something like that, and then saying, oh, I'm gonna go run for X number of hours or however long it takes to burn off those number of calories, I think it's like doubly bad from a metabolic standpoint, um, because of not only what's in the icy, but also now you have a lack of nutrition to fuel your exercise. So the whole paradigm is just, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any, it doesn't produce such great results. I mean, a lot of people, there's a high, I guess, recidivism would be, that's usually used in regards to going to jail. But as far as like returning to an overweight state after going on the diet, is like that happens for a lot of people. It happens pretty frequently. And then a lot of people wind up in worse issues. And I've seen it with a lot of people where they diet their weight down, they lose a ton of weight. And then as soon as they stop restricting, they put it back on. And then, so then usually the point that I start to see them or start to have worked with them is when they've put the weight back on after dieting down. And now we can't get the weight off because they're in a metabolic hole because they dieted down so hard, they got their caloric intake down so low that when you try and get the weight off by raising caloric intake, the body is just saying, no, we're just going to store this because the past famine that we went through was so strong. And so you get this perpetual cycle of continually lowering metabolism, and depleting nutrients and then filling up on garbage diet food, which is essentially just a whole bunch of artificial sweeteners mixed in different foods with high fiber contents. Very limited nutrition in any of this stuff. And it just, the paradigm is, and there's some talk about the paradigm being created by industry interests to push a certain narrative to take the focus off of poor quality food choices and move it towards the idea of calories in, calories out, which allows people to justify eating poor food and then moving into exercising or expending energy to burn off those poor food choices. And it doesn't work. I don't think in a long-term perspective, it doesn't work for next month, or losing X number of pounds to fit in a wedding dress for just your wedding and then gaining it all back later. You know, that sure, you'll lose X 5 pounds by dieting extremely hard X number of weeks before your wedding to get into your dress. But then what happens after? And then the question is, what happens with long-term health after that? And you can look at populations that take the dieting down to an extreme, and you see the bodybuilder populations. the bodybuilder populations diet extremely hard to get to their shows and they get extremely lean, but that they're known to feel absolutely terrible, as with most people who go on diets. And then they also get to a point where their hormonal levels are castration levels. You have full grown 250-pound, 5% body fat men at female levels of testosterone if they're not using steroids because of their dieting practices, and completely dysregulated um, cortisol or stress hormone responses, and their thyroid hormone turned off. So the I don't see the benefit in the strategy. And so I mean, we'll talk about what are better strategies. And again, I think the underpinnings here is not calories in, calories out. It's food choice and following the cues of your body and eating to satiety.
Yeah. Yeah, and just add in real quick too, as far as the bodybuilding side is, of course, the hormonal use there from their end is also a contributor to the really low androgens and everything. But the dieting is definitely kind of coupled with the dieting is a pretty
Well,
terrible
the
recipe.
androgens they're using exogenous when they do the cuts and they go to shows, they're still on. A lot of them are still on steroids unless the show is tested. So if the show
Right.
is tested, they could, for natural bodybuilders, when they cut down that low, it decimates their
Mm.
hormone profile. So it's not necessarily from stopping the steroids before the show. I mean, in some cases that could be. I know it's splitting hairs, but for a lot of them, the dieting itself is causing it in the natural bodybuilders. The super big guys are you couldn't get a reading on their testosterone because they're using exogenous steroids regardless.
Right. And that I was saying, like, when they get off the steroids, a lot of times there's a lot of issues
Yeah,
there.
that'll come down.
That,
But
yeah.
for I'm saying for natural guys who
Okay.
are at high levels of muscle tissue, when they diet down like that, it
Mm.
completely decimates their hormonal profiles. Um, you have extreme raises in stress hormones like cortisol and the catecholamines, and
Mm.
you have huge drop offs in testosterone and thyroid hormone. And you can go on YouTube and watch, and they'll tell you they feel like absolute crap. And most people who are dieting will tell you they feel like absolute crap. And then,
Yeah.
so a lot of people will say they initially feel good the first week. And I think that can be easily argued to be a raise in stress hormones, which can initially make you feel good, but eventually you start to exhaust those pathways and crash. And I think a lot of people see that. And then I think part of people seeing that is that's part of what you see with the low carb crowd and the keto flu and all this stuff. Some people don't do well with the low carb, and they crash a lot earlier than others. And you see it with the flu and then the constant low energy. And if you go into any of those forums or any of these models for low carb or the fasting groups or um the the calorie counting groups or things like that, or the different forums or groups that are associated around some sort of model, you tend to see a bunch of people trying it out on the forum being, hey, I'm having a really hard time, I'm not feeling very well, I keep getting sick, I don't have a lot of energy. And everybody's just like, oh, just keep doing it, keep doing it, and eventually you'll feel like the more you have to just keep doing more, you have to cut your calories more, you have to lower your carbs more, you have to restrict your feeding window more. And it just, for a lot of people it crashes them. For some people they seem to be able to manage it somehow, but I think for most people in long term you find that it doesn't really work. And then you find
Yeah.
that in um across multiple different strategies. You can
Yeah.
even see people, and this people do have problems within the peak community as well, but it really depends on what your interpretation of the principles are. And that's why there's not a specific set of, you need to eat these foods, you need to eat them this way. It's principles. What are the underlying principles? And that's what we're going to get at.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're saying, it's kind of it's definitely unsustainable, that whole dieting cycle, whether it's in regard to calories or carbs. And a lot of times people feel pretty terrible when they're doing it. Sometimes they don't, but for how long? Like, for how long do they not feel that way? And as you were kind of getting at too, with that dieting cycle, it's never ending. There's no solution. There's no end point where it's like you can go back to eating a normal amount of food. Instead, that the amount of food that you get to eat just keeps going down and down, lower and lower, until you're barely eating, and you just end up coming up with all of these strategies to eat less, and you end up starving your body. And as you were getting at, as far as the problems with the calorie model, calories in versus calories out, and so many of these other approaches, the underlying issue with weight gain in general comes down to a lack of energy, which is of course relatively counterintuitive, and we discussed those things, at a little more length in previous weight loss episodes that I'll link to. But an important point there is that the reason why our bodies have hunger or are hungry at any particular point is because they don't have the energy they need. And and it's so important. Like, I don't know of anything more important than that, as far as just completely dismantling this idea that we need to be fighting against our hunger and that we need to be dieting. Like, if our hunger is a direct result of a lack of energy, which it is, shown to be the case in as far as liver ATP levels and the ATP levels in certain parts of our brain that regulate hunger, specifically in the hypothalamus.
ATP being a marker of amount of energy being produced.
Right. So assuming that that's the case, which is supported, then the idea that we want to be fighting against hunger makes no sense at all. And it just leads to this never-ending dieting cycle where you keep eating less and less. And as you said, you lose weight, and then eventually if assuming that you can't continue to resist and can't keep using that willpower because it's limited, you end up eating more and then you gain more weight and you're in a worse place than you started, or you don't, which is arguably worse if you just keep eating less and less forever. And then you are very, you might be lean, but you're also not eating anything. And then at that point, you end up having all these major metabolic costs too. And as you're saying, it does lead to this metabolic hole that does take a while, or can take quite a while to dig out of. And we see that all the time where, it can be pretty tough to work through that. And yet and you mentioned the other side of this too, which is the industry side. And I don't know how it happens that every single year you have the same groups of people, and I'm not trying to, like, by no means is this blaming the people, but it's like they get us. Like, they get us into believing that this is the year, and that, as of January 1st, we're going to join whatever program, or we're going to do Weight Watchers or whatever it is, and we're going to lose all this weight. And so much, it's like a joke as far as how many people sign up for the gym and stay there for a month and are gone by February 1st, and how busy the gym is during January. And the same thing with all of the dieting spheres, where it's known that this is just a short-term thing. And as you said, it makes a lot of money for the people who are encouraging that. But even if you want to argue that it works in the short term and there's no cost, which obviously there are huge costs, and so we disagree there, but it's pretty hard to argue that it works in the long term. And at that point, the only argument that you have is that everybody who can't do it is just weak. They're just weak-willed, and they're just not trying hard enough, which is not the case. Everything in your body when you're not eating enough is telling you to eat more for good reason.